everybody. Welcome to another episode from Your Own Pathway, where we heal, rise, and break patterns that never served us. So let's own it. Well, first, I want to say happy March and happy Women's History Month. So I want to get that not out, but I just want to say that. And I also want to acknowledge that we are living in a really hard, chaotic time. And I hope that you all are taking care of yourselves in these times and to do what is best for you. So, moving on, I want to talk about today's episode. And today's episode actually came from something that stayed with me after a dream. And also many of the conversations that I had with over the years with clients when I was doing one-on-one therapy work. And the phrase that kept coming to me was this: you don't owe loyalty to your trauma. And the more I sat with that phrase of not sitting with your trauma, the more I realized how many people struggled with this idea, especially children of immigrants, refugees, and first generation cycle breakers. And when I talk about first generation cycle breakers, I want to say it's beyond money. It's about the environment and it's about the expectations too. You could have been born wealthy and had all the resources and still be a first generational cycle breaker. So I want to clarify that. Because for many of us, trauma wasn't just something that happened, it became an identity, it became culture, it became the story that we tell about who we are. And in the work that I do clinically, I often see people who are trying to move forward in their lives, build stability, build peace, build something different, try to have, maintain their boundaries and standards. But they feel like if they move beyond survival, they are somehow betraying where they came from. Moving on, I want to talk about the community expectations and the shared trauma. And sometimes this dynamic shows up in ways that we don't talk about openly. For example, when someone leaves a neighborhood and becomes successful, and success can mean many things, not just money. Maybe this person pursued education. Maybe they build financial stability. Maybe they start a business, or maybe they simply created a life that is more peaceful than the one that they grew up in. And then suddenly there can be this expectation that they owe loyalty back to that community. I think a lot of us have heard this, especially when we hear about well known public figures who grew up in poverty or in very unstable environments and they become successful again, like public wise, financially, whatever it is. And they hear or they talk about how they would say, oh, people would say to them, oh, don't forget where you came from, or remember, stay humble. I've heard that too. I don't know if some of you, I'm sure some of you who are watching this, who choose to watch this, are probably the ones who are saying, do I owe loyalty to my trauma? Is this what it is? Stay humble. Remember, stay humble, or remember your people. I think for a lot of us who grew up in marginalized communities, when we move beyond our community and start doing things that seem very individualistic, a lot of people will always like to remind us, remember your people, remember your origins, and of course, stay humble. And I just want to clarify, these statements can come from love and pride, but sometimes there is something deeper that is happening underneath this conversation. Sometimes what is really being protected is this shared trauma as identity. In the work that I do with clients, especially those who are first generation or cycle breakers, this dynamic often shows up. And when someone begins to stabilize their life, saying, you know what, I'm going to work and I'm going to stabilize my life. And that stabilization can mean different things for different people. And this can look like, you know what, I want to heal. So they begin healing. Start seeing a therapist, or they're very, they have boundaries and standards about who has their time or energy. Um, and with that, they move out of survival mode. And suddenly they start to feel guilty because they, are working to be out of the survival mode. And people kind of remind them, hey, what about us? And so they started to feel guilty. Not that because they did anything wrong, but because moving forward can feel like leaving something behind. When communities go through hardship together, survival often becomes the glue that holds people together. The shared struggle becomes the story everyone understands. And that story can be very meaningful, but it can also create an unspoken rule. And that is, if we suffer together, we stay together in that suffering. So, when someone begins to move beyond the environment, people may interpret that growth as disloyalty. But the thing is, growth is not betrayal. Healing is not abandonment. And building stability does not mean you are rejecting where you came from. And shared trauma does not create a lifetime of obligation. So, next, I want to talk about trauma and when trauma becomes your identity, and often times the trauma bonding. And in many communities, survival becomes the core identity because struggle becomes proof of strength, endurance becomes a virtue, and sacrifice is becomes like authentic. And when someone begins to move beyond survival, when they build stability, when they find peace, when they expand, that can feel threatening to that identity. But again, survival was never meant to be the destination. I'll say that again. Survival was never meant to be the destination. It was the beginning. Yes, you can honor your ancestors without reenacting their suffering. So, I want to talk next about resilience because, especially in social work and therapy, we talk so much about, oh, they're so resilient and these children are so resilient. And at one point, I also really, embrace the resilience that I went through too. And we all have stories of resilience. And yes, it's very empowering. And at the same time, it's like, what else am I supposed to do? Like some of us laugh and go, well, what other option do I have? If I'm not resilient, what other option? And so sometimes resilience is the word that really comes up when we talk about trauma and survival. And resilience is powerful. Again, like resilience is powerful. Resilience can also be very beautiful. And resilience is what allowed many of our parents and grandparents and our ancestors to survive incredibly difficult circumstances. But I want to say resilience also tells a deeper story. Resilience often means struggle. Resilience often means suffering. Resilience often means survivor environments that were never meant to be humane in the first place. So the question becomes yes, we are resilient. We were resilient. But do we need to pass that same expectation of resilience onto the next generation? Because resilience is something that we honor, but it doesn't have to be something that we repeat. So, as I am going through this episode, I want to clarify some two things. Like one thing is the difference between integrity versus loyal to trauma. And what I mean by this is that there is an important distinction between the two. Integrity means that you remain grounded in your values, your ethics, and your sense of self. Integrity is internal. Integrity is something that you carry within yourself wherever you go. But loyalty to trauma says something different. Loyalty to trauma says you must stay connected to the struggle or the identity of suffering in order to prove that you belong. You can have integrity without remaining loyal to trauma. You can honor where you came from without centering suffering as your identity. So, to close out the episode, I want to leave with all of you with this today. It's to remind all of you that you do not owe loyalty to your trauma. You can still have integrity. You can still have honor where you came from. You can still carry your culture and your values with you. But you are not required to center your life around suffering in order to prove that you belong. We can all honor our ancestors, our lineage, suffering. And resilience is something that we honor, not something every generation has to repeat. So that is all I have for you all today. And this is your own pathway. Remember, you get to choose healing, you get to choose stability, you get to choose expansion. So own it. Take care of yourself this week, today. And again, this is your own pathway. As always, own it.